Hello, everybody who is joining us for this Global Government Forum webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from for this event to launch the second edition of the Responsive Government Survey. My name is Richard Johnston, and I'm the Executive Editor of Global Government Forum, which is a media and events company and website focused on bringing together public and civil servants from around the world to share best practice and help address common problems. And as part of that mission, Global Government Forum and our knowledge partner, PA Consulting, have come together to investigate how responsive governments are to the many challenges that they face in the 21st century. The first responsive government survey was conducted in 2021 and provided unrivaled insight into perceptions of government's responsiveness in the immediate aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic. And the background for the second survey, which was undertaken in late 2022, was just as tumultuous. High inflation, budgetary pressures, and volatility caused by global conflicts, as well as mass industrial action, added to the impact of the pandemic from the previous survey and how governments were recovering from it. So in this session, we're going to share some of the insights from the 2023 Global Responsive Government Survey that was published late last month, as well as looking at how the confidence of public servants has changed between those two surveys. Then we'll hear from some of the experts who contributed to the report and who have kindly joined us today. We would also love to hear from you. If you have a question that follows on from the research or from what the report finds, or if you'd like to ask our panel for advice on how to be more responsive in your own work, please do get in touch using the Q&A button that you will see on your Zoom app. Before I set out the headline findings from the report, do let me introduce the rest of the panel who have joined us today. First, we're joined by Greta Kevlind Berg, the Managing Partner and Country Head for Norway in the PA Consulting Group. Greta leads PA Norway's public sector practice and is an expert in delivering digital transformation in the public healthcare sector. She leads large government initiatives, redefining citizen services using a user-centric approach and co-creation across several public sectors. Greta also leads Norway's hub for innovative healthcare service design and leads transformation of mental health and systemic patient services across local governments and hospitals. So hello, Greta, and thank you for joining us today. We're also joined by Alexander Evans, OBE, the Professor of Practice in Public Policy at the London School of Economics. Alexander is a former Strategy Director in the UK Cabinet Office and also a former Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress and a former Senior Fellow at Yale. A career diplomat, he has worked in number 10 Downing Street in the UK as an advisor to the Prime Minister, as a strategy director in the Cabinet Office, as I mentioned, and Director Cyber in the Foreign Office. He's also worked for the United Nations and the US State Department. And last but by no means least, we're joined by Michael Vernick, the Jarolowski Chair of Public Sector Management at the University of Ottawa and a former Cabinet Secretary in the Canadian Government. Michael's distinguished 38-year career as one of the key leaders of Canada's world-class federal public service culminated in serving as the Clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary to Cabinet, and that came after 28 years as an executive in federal public service, including 17 years in the community of deputy ministers. All this makes Michael one of Canada's most experienced and influential public sector leaders, and in his current role at the University of Ottawa, he now provides advisory services and mentorship to emerging leaders and to new generations of students. So it was great to get all of our panelists and perspectives on the Responsive Government Survey when I was working on the report, and it's fantastic to have them join us today to discuss the findings. And as I say, please get your thoughts or questions into the panel. And we will get to a discussion of the report findings very shortly. But before we do that, and before I ask the panel to share their kind of initial responses to the research, I want to share some of the results from the survey itself. So first slide, please, Raquel. Thank you very much. And we'll start with an overview of what the Responsive Government Survey is. So next slide, please, Raquel. So the Responsive Government Survey sets out to investigate the responsiveness and agility of public services around the world. The research programme, which, as I mentioned, is conducted in partnership with PA Consulting, and thanks very much to PA for their help throughout this project, is designed to identify how able governments around the world are to respond to the challenges they face across many facets. And we've already mentioned some of these, the pandemic recovery, public finances under pressure, increased volatility in the age of permacrisis, but there's also others. I'm sure many of the audience watching along will be able to identify: increased citizen demand, expectation for digital services, the pressures of an ageing population, amongst others. So we wanted to find out how able governments are to respond to these challenges and how confident they are in doing so. The research fieldwork takes the form of a questionnaire where government participants are asked to score their organisations on various attributes that we identified as drivers of responsive government. The two surveys we have conducted so far have produced a robust sample size. In the inaugural survey in 2021, there was 873 participants, and then when we expanded it last year, we got 1,796 public servants responding in the survey that was completed last year, across 9 countries: Australia, Canada, Denmark, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, the UK and the US. So this presentation will break down some of the overall global trends from that sample in the main, but we'll touch on some of the national data as well. And if there is more kind of specific insight you would like after the presentation, as I said, please do get in touch in the Q&A function, or we can also provide that information after the webinar if you get in touch, and I don't have it instantly at my fingertips. So next slide, please, Raquel. Once we've got those responses in, we analysed the responses and identified 5 key priorities for responsive governments, and these are them. Rethinking responsiveness, so how the way government reacts to demands can keep pace to the demands that they face. Embracing positive leadership, how public service leaders can catalyse improvements in public services. Going deeper with digital and data, the role of better use of technology can play in creating more responsive governments. Building citizen-centric culture, the extent to which government departments and agencies use feedback and information from users to improve services. And governing through a permacrisis, how public and civil service contingency planning has stood up to that list of pressures that we've already discussed from recent years, from pandemics to energy price shocks. So next slide, please, Raquel. We'll delve into all of those throughout this brief overview presentation. But we titled this webinar "Success in an Era of Permacrisis," and that is illustrated, I think, in the response to this question, which we asked in both the fieldwork of the last 2 reports, which is our overall kind of statement of responsiveness. My organisation excels at learning and responding rapidly to meeting evolving citizen and end user needs. As you can see from this graph, there was a decline in the proportion who said they either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, a 5-point decline from 72% to 67%. So that shows that there has been an impact of the era of permacrisis, but it is very much worth noting that is still a very high score. 67% of officials are saying that their organisation excels at learning and responding rapidly to meeting evolving citizen and end user needs. So that is still a very positive result, I think, for public servants around the world. But that hints a little bit at the story throughout the report. There's been declines in confidence across a number of the measures that we use in the Responsive Government Survey. But what for the want of a better phrase, you could call resilient resilience. A lot of the scores are still high, even despite the declines on the kind of year-on-year basis. And there's a couple of other points that just highlighted in this key finding, and we'll get to them both. Confidence that public services can be improved and how to do it has also fallen on the measure, and there is a concern over the impact of politics on delivery, and officials are also less confident in their organisation's contingency plans in that era of permacrisis, an extended period of instability and insecurity. So on the next slide, please, Raquel, you'll get into the rethinking responsiveness heading. This is where we start to see, I think, some of the tensions in government responsiveness. For example, 63% of all respondents say that their organisation adapts policies and services based on learning from success and failures, but there is a bit less confidence in resources available to do so. As you can see from the graph, less than half of officials, 45%, agree that they can quickly allocate budget and resources to priority initiatives. And that again is slightly down from the last survey, and among the other results, only a third of respondents feel there are few barriers to quickly developing policy ideas into implementation plans. And then we did ask respondents for kind of one single action that would help improve the agility of their governments, and when we looked into those answers, two factors were the most commonly reoccurring: addressing funding issues and resourcing roadblocks. So those are the two things that kind of public servants are highlighting as barriers to responsiveness and going further to improve the responsiveness. But as I said, it's from a very high baseline. Next slide, please, Raquel, is looking at embracing positive leadership. Across many elements of the responsiveness, an interesting contrast emerged between leaders and the overall response group themselves. Leaders feel more positive about their organization's performances in the main and their employee morale than their rank and file colleagues. More leaders agree that morale is high in their organization, for example, by 10 whole points, 64% versus 54% that you can see in that graph. And likewise, while 63% of civil servants in the overall sample say that their organization adopts to what they do based on what works, that rises to 72% for civil service leaders. One note I will make here, just for interest for when we get to Michael's contribution, is that interestingly, leaders in Canada are not quite as confident as those elsewhere. Leader scores in Canada are behind the overall national group sometimes, but overall, the leaders throughout the survey are more positive about their organizations. And one of the conclusions from the report is that leaders really need to kind of temper their confidence a little bit, or perhaps widen the kind of their awareness of staff attitudes and capacity and knowledge, so that they can understand how their organizations are working and what their organizations are feeling, because there's a little bit of a disparity there at the moment. Leaders need to show government projects and initiatives that meet the challenges that citizens, including their employees, currently face, that that initiatives can do that. Purposeful leadership was, of course, a major factor in the COVID-19 response, and that was fueled by collaboration, knowledge sharing, and agility, and that provides a very kind of good template for kind of more embracing that positive leadership across the board, across all ranges of public services. Next slide, please, Raquel, is on digital services and going deeper with digital and data. These are key elements to creating a more responsive government, with digitalisation of public services now the norm. But again, there's been a slight fall. Confidence that technology is being used to drive the best policy solutions has fallen among the public servants in our survey. 40% say that digital technologies are fully embedded in policy making and service design, and that was down from 49% in 2021. A key cause for this perceived lack of utilisation appears to be financial. Only 38% of respondents and only slightly more, 42% of leaders agree that the funding is available for the long-term investment in digital transformation. However, there is also a positive story here in that 2/3 of respondents say that how their governments responded to COVID has accelerated progress in digital capabilities. This is in contrast to some of the other questions we asked around whether the COVID response had changed government. For example, there's only 1 in 3 people, respondents, 37% or so, say that the COVID response has made it easier to implement new policies and ideas. So there's quite a difference there in the proportion who have said that COVID has accelerated digital capability. So there's clearly an opportunity from governments around the world to strengthen digital infrastructure and services. So that is kind of something that's made fairly clear from the report. And one of the findings was the importance of integrating digital and data utilization with people so that people with lower digital literacy are not left behind. One leader in the Canadian Public Service who responded to the survey was calling for a faster transition to digital solutions and accelerated support for online service provision, so that those two things can go together, better services and kind of additional support for the people who need it to access it. The next slide, please, Raquel, is kind of follows on from that in terms of service provision, on looking at how to build a citizen-centric culture in government. Across the board, there was again a drop in the confidence that the processes to improve public services were working. The proportion of officials who believe their organisation had a cyclical improvement process to integrate citizen and end user feedback fell from 58% in 2021 to 45% in the latest survey. That's the biggest overall decline in any category year on year, hinting at a underutilisation of user feedback. The same proportion of respondents, so 45%, said that wherever possible, our organisation uses citizen or end user input to form policy and implementation solutions. And again, that had fallen from 53% in the previous survey, so an 8-point drop. So yeah, there's clearly been a little bit of a change there in terms of how confident people are that they're using citizen feedback to drive public service improvement. There was also an interesting finding on the impact of electoral politics on policy delivery. When asked if the need for long-term planning on policy and service design was well understood at a ministerial level and not impacted by election cycles, more public servants disagreed than agreed. 40% disagreed and 34% agreed only. So that's an interesting finding in terms of the impact of electoral politics. And we also asked officials if wholesale system change is considered within their organisation to drive service improvements. Overall, only 32% of officials said that it was, and interestingly, only in one country, in Denmark, did a majority of officials agree that kind of wholesale system change is considered an option. Next slide, please, Raquel. This is looking at how governments have responded to this era of permacrisis in the 2020s that they have faced, and how ready they are for what comes next. Perhaps it is unsurprising that the proportion of officials with high confidence that their organisation has robust contingency plans has fallen since 2021. You can see it on that graph there, from 56% to 45%. But again, to make the point I made earlier, this is still high, and confidence in contingencies is highest amongst some of the Nordic countries who responded. For a majority are confident in their countries, in their organizations' contingency planning, for example, in Norway and in Denmark. And agreement is also above 50% in Australia. The proportion of officials who believe that their organisation has cyclical improvement processes has also fallen year on year, though, across the whole sample from 58% to 45%. This is the section I think we can see most clearly the resilience of public servants. This next statistic here, over half think their organisation can still capitalise on emerging opportunities, even from in the era of permacrisis, and nearly 3/4 of public servants, so 71%, agree that that being able to adapt to significant change is part of their organisation's long-term strategy. And in line with the survey-wide trends I mentioned earlier, there is greater confidence among leaders in their organisation's abilities to respond to uncertainty on both of those scores. So there's still strong confidence in how public servants can respond to the pressures and challenges that they face. And I think that really shows up that this is about resilience in a lot of what has been a fairly unprecedented time for a lot of officials. If you go on to the next slide, Raquel, just to share some conclusions before we hear from our panel. So these are the conclusions that we came to. Governments can improve their responsiveness and adaptability through actionable data-based strategies. There is a role for technology here, and there's a role for leadership. Action across these 5 priorities that we've just discussed can transform traditionally sluggish services into proactive, positive, digitally enabled, citizen-centric and future-ready solutions. And yes, that last point, leaders are the key ingredient. It really stood out how more confident leaders are in their organisation, and their confidence is contagious and can be contagious. And those in leadership positions can help to build confident, forward-looking teams that can create those citizen-centric and future-ready services. So that is a very brief and whistle-stop survey of coverage of the responsive government survey. You will see there the website where you can view the full survey report. You can also view all the data from the responsive government survey that underpins those findings on the website. And there is a lot of data and information to get into there. And I appreciate that I have also just thrown a lot of data and information at you as well. So we will make these slides available as part of the report from today's webinar. So you'll be able to look at those again as well. But I will kind of take a breath there, and I'll ask Greta to come in and share her findings, share her thoughts on the report's research and some of the findings. Greta.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I will reflect upon some of the findings with some experiences from my home country, Norway. So please go to the next slide, Rachel. So we just learned that there are 5 priorities for responsive governments, and I will look into a little bit about the responsiveness, digital and data, and citizen-centric culture. Next slide, please. So as many of you probably experienced during Corona, this is a picture from the Norwegian Medical Association. It exploded with use of video consultations, and I work with digitization in public healthcare in the Nordic countries. And I think we have tried for 15 years to start using video consultations. And finally, during Corona, in March 2020, not long time after the country closed down, 80% of the GPs used video consultations, and we had a lot of use of video consultations in the hospitals across Norway. And this was a wanted change in Norway because so many things can be done digital, and we have a difficult geography, so we just clapped our hands. But next slide, Rachel. But what happened after the vaccines came? The video statistics, we have beautiful statistics in the government of Norway. It went down, and not many video consultations anymore. Despite we had a quite good reimbursement system, despite technically I think were quite good in Norway. And the patient feedback gathered from the Norwegian newspaper Today's Medicine was great. The patients said video consultations are just as good or better than the physical consultations. But when we started to dig further into that, we could see why health professionals fell back into old methods. They weren't equipped with enough learning. It wasn't good enough information sent to the citizens. There were some things about the infrastructure. And actually, I think our government has done some great measures now on a full system change. So we can see that the statistics are going the right directions again. Next slide, please, Rachel. So digital government makes life easier. It makes my life easier. This is a picture from the login page on healthnorway.no, where I can log in with my bank ID using the national ID portal. I enter my birth date and I use a sign-on certificate I have on my phone. And then I can access a lot of government services, including my health data. I can ask for new prescriptions from my doctor. I can look after all the prescriptions, old and new ones. I can book appointments. I can also log into pages where I can see data about my children in kindergarten. So the digital government in Norway and other Nordic countries have come quite far. And how come? What have we done? I think an important thing has been to think and act citizen-centric. These things are easy to use. From infrastructure, because it doesn't work that it's just electricity on paper. It must be a full digitization, not ending up in a PDF that you have to print. That's not user-friendly. It needs to be user-friendly at both sides, both for my doctor and for me as an end user. And I think we have come quite far in the Nordics to have fully digitized processes that really make life easier for me as a citizen and for the civil servants. And then you gain benefits. So let's go to the next slide, Rachel. So this is a picture from a woman in Oslo. And she is, from her living room, she's able to get treatment for her heart condition. And she also have a severe lung diagnosis. And what our government has done is to make healthcare accessible for anywhere. It's very important both for citizens so they can access our public healthcare services, but it's also very important to free up time because we have so many elderly and also young adults that need more time for physical care. And citizen centricity has been very important in this work, as well as the government working with legislation, policies, and empowering municipalities and health regions to create change themselves. Next slide, please. So I think what we have learned from this in Norway, because we had traditionally a lot of money in this country, and we probably still have. So we have had enough money to buy technology. But if we start with technology and try to make it meaningful afterwards, we just bring on new challenges and new needs and actually increase costs. But when we start with the citizen needs and look what the citizen and civil servants need to have to make life easier, then we build that technology. It's meaningful to and easier to use, and we have profitable solutions that are based on citizen needs, and we reap more benefits from it. So that was some of PA Consulting's reflections, reading the results from the report. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Greta. Really great insight there, and I love seeing kind of specific examples of how governments are kind of embracing change and becoming more responsive to their citizens. Some great examples there, and again we can share these slides as part of the webinar report. Next, I'm going to ask Alexander for his thoughts on the report findings.
Richard, thanks very much, and very good to join both Greta and Michael on this call. I very much align myself with Greta's comments, which I agree with wholeheartedly. So look, I mean, first off, I mean, yeah, I think it's a really informative survey, and it comes at an important time as governments are pulling out of the COVID crisis, sometimes pulling out of that to suddenly see all the other crises that they're handling. But it is a distinctive moment after what was an all-consuming health crisis for all governments around the world. But at the same time, I don't think the figures that we're seeing here, and Richard, that you briefed so well, are that shocking. So what do we see? We see that leaders tend to be a bit more optimistic than rank and file officials. And a bit of that probably reflects the fact that leaders are in a better position to understand not necessarily the micro problems, but understand that combination of the analytics of problems and the potential solutions that can be applied. So it's a little bit like heading off on a country drive that you think is going to take 5 hours. And leaders have the GPS and the weather data that tells them the traffic's going to be bad, weather's going to be bad, it's going to take 7 hours. And that information isn't available to all their colleagues at more junior levels. At the same time, you could say that leaders are sometimes just inclined to a bit more optimism bias, and that infects both political leaders and senior civil servants sometimes in thinking about the problems that are faced by government, both around policy making and delivery. I think the BDAT, the digital data and technology figures, are really interesting. We know that some things have been true for a while. It's difficult for government to recruit and retain experts, and it's very expensive to buy in the consultancy services that can bridge some of those gaps. The pay gap is very striking, whether it's for technologists or data analytics capabilities or others. But there's also a governance gap in terms of making sure that we have senior officials who can be properly intelligent customers of technology investments and services. And that, I think, is something that's quite visible, particularly at middle level in government, where you see, if you like, that picture around procurement and oversight, but you're also seeing some of the challenges faced by the implementation of government technology projects. It is worth, I think, us pausing to reflect on the declining confidence scores here, Richard, that you talked about. The experience of and after COVID includes fast adaptation to online and hybrid working, including in public services delivery. So, but as Greta was setting out, we did see, years of change compressed into a couple of years. The question is whether we can bake in some of those behaviours going forward. And a lot of those behaviours about cultural change as much as capabilities in the public sector. We could dig a bit beneath the headline figures here. Money and the scale of investment is clearly a problem, but that's always going to be a problem. Governments will never have enough. And, as every chief technology officer or chief information officer peering up at their permanent secretary and minister will say, we need 10x in terms of investment, and you're offering 1x. That, I think, will remain true. The question is, what do you do with the quantum of capital and admin budget that you get? Government, what I would call government UX, government user experience, citizen expectations are growing ever higher. And that's an old trend, but it's also a new trend. It's been a continuing trend since the 1980s, but it's been really accentuated and accelerated by the digital customer experience, the digital citizen experience we all have on these devices. We basically expect government to be able to provide the same kind of public services with the same kind of customer and citizen touch and user touch that commercial providers will provide to us on these devices. So I think this provides a bit of context for the fast falling figures on how confident civil servants are about using citizen and customer feedback. We just haven't quite wired that in yet to the way in which we do public policy and design public services. On responsiveness, the perennial challenge is what to deprioritise in order to surge into new priorities or proactive policy making. And perhaps the thing that doesn't quite surface itself in this data is the fact that governments in general, both politicians and senior officials, were very good at saying, gosh, we really need to do new work on this, assemble a new team, assemble a new task force, where less good at properly deprioritising and making sure that choice on deprioritization flows through into a civil service system at large. And again, a comment from my side, this isn't just about money, it's about leadership, which is why this central question of leadership is so important and so illuminated by the survey. And finally, I might sort of suck my teeth a bit about a permacrisis. That suggests a bit of a war footing on all fronts for all governments. But I think we are in an era of permacrisis. You look at the aftershocks from COVID-19, the continuing shocks of the war in Ukraine, the challenge of high inflation, what is a tight job market but challenge to growth in many of these economies, and more appetite for industrial action by public servants around the world. And this is a lot for governments to handle. So I think we should expect a bit of a hit, and we see it in the figures, in terms of both individual and collective resilience in public service organisations. There are more gaps in staffing, and the challenge of immediate problems squeezes out space for adaptive or futures-based thinking. It's really difficult in the first place to get seniors, particularly when you're talking about political seniors, but also true of senior civil servants, to talk about what ifs, especially if most of the meetings are about now what? You know, what's on our plate now? What have we got to tackle next? My final comment really would be about the fact that wholesale system change still feels really challenging. No great surprise. Officials do more on the now than the next, and that feeds into the survey data, showing falling confidence in robust contingency plans. And Nordic countries, as you said, Richard, have tended to maintain slightly greater contingency capabilities than some other countries, which may reflect, what you were saying about the difference that they may see in scores. So my thanks again, Richard, to you and the team. I think this is a really valuable survey and it's fascinating findings.
Great, thanks, Alexander. I think that's a really useful contribution in terms of different factors that perhaps play into some of the findings and some of the analysis that flows from them. We'll get into that more in the Q&A portion that follows shortly, so please do keep your questions coming in. But just want to get some opening thoughts from Michael as well before we do that. Michael.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the Global Government Forum and its partners for doing this piece of work. First of all, I think it is very useful. I always am intrigued by comparative work across jurisdictions, and I think starting to build a time series where you can follow the trends will pay off in the future. So thank you for doing the work. I find myself in agreement with my fellow panelists on so many things, so I think I'll just try to throw in a few extra angles of of commentary and hopefully provoke people for the Q&A. So if it doesn't quite hang together, that's why. Why do we see the changes between years? I think is one of the things that's most intriguing. Part of it is the difficulty of getting the right time scale. I mean, a historian would be talking now about the transition from the long Elizabethan era to the new Carolinian era. I find myself going back to what life was like in the early and mid 90s in Canada, and the cumulative load of political and economic crisis was probably every bit as much a challenge as the current one, but obviously in a different environment. But let's zoom in if we on the pandemic years. There are a number of explanations that people have already alluded to. I think part of it may just be cumulative fatigue of 2 or 3 years of really being stretched in many parts of the public sector. And so there's a certain fatigue factor that I hear a lot about anecdotally and may start showing up in survey work. Some of it is what was alluded to, the kind of snapback effect. There's an initial change and enthusiasm, and inevitably some other factor, Newtonian mechanics, kicks in. So The enthusiasm for digital government then generates a response from the privacy and cybersecurity communities that, we have to be careful about this and so on. I think what may be going on now, at least in Canada and some other jurisdictions, is that you have so many hotspots simultaneously stretching the system as a system. My experience is certainly, includes a lot of episodes of crisis or drama in particular parts of government, but they tended to be spaced. And while one part of the public sector was going through crisis, it could get the full attention of the center of government and the political class, and eventually would be resolved. But other parts of the public sector would just soldier on, doing their, keep calm, carry on, and deliver your things, and attention will come back to you. What's really striking about the last few years is how many parts of the public sector are being stretched simultaneously. And it sort of goes to the theme of resilience, systemic resilience, resilience for an individual organization, and resilience for your public service leader. All of these are being tested for sure. A couple of other comments. I mean, the wish for more resources is a permanent feature of the public sector. I think particularly now it's wishful thinking. I think most governments are now in a period of tapping the brakes and fiscal correction, and certainly in Canada, a long cycle of growth and expansion is coming abruptly to an end. We are already into downsizing of operational budgets over the next few years, and there could be much more dramatic spending reviews in the very near future. So you can wish for more resources, but I certainly agree it's going to be more about optimizing how you use them and making choices. I think what jumps out, in a lot of the conversation, and it's happening again today, is the asymmetry between public services that are outward facing to citizens, voters, taxpayers, versus the internal workings of government. It's almost an iron law. It's always going to be easier to get politicians to rally around fixing or improving externally facing services. They may be slow to come around. It may take a crisis to really trigger it. But if there's a problem, as we experienced here on passport services or immigration processing, money and resources and attention will eventually be thrown at it. And what seems to be much, much harder to get attention to are the internal workings of government, which we all know matter so much. Pay systems, human resource systems, finance, record management, IT systems, and so on. And I think the lived experience of public servants, from what I can tell, really hasn't changed that much on things like staffing. It's still slow and cumbersome. Even external purchasing and procurement doesn't seem to be that different than it was 5 or 10 years ago. So, and that's the world in which a lot of middle managers work and live. So I find nothing surprising about a gap between how senior leaders and middle leaders see the world. They live in different worlds. Their daily experience is different. I do agree there's a kind of a selection bias for resilience and optimism, to get promoted and stay in the very senior positions. And there's a different sort of perspective. You're going to a lot of committees and task forces and meetings about change initiatives. You're aware that the system is trying to improve itself, however imperfectly. Whereas if you're in the middle layer, you're just trying to deliver, your area of responsibility, and you may not have the peripheral vision that gives you some confidence that, change is coming or effort is being made. I think what you may be seeing in the snapback as well is just how work gets done in a lot of organizations. We've had this discussion about return to work, and it was a big factor in public sector strike here in the federal level not too long ago. So again, I think it's the sort of snapback. Everybody was very excited to move to very inclusive, Zoom and Teams style meetings for getting together. All staff meetings, a lot of very useful innovation, accelerated. It might have taken 10 years, happened in 1 or 2. Now we're realizing that poorly chaired meetings on Zoom are no better than poorly chaired meetings in a boardroom. Are they actually deliberative? Are they decisive? Or are they just a talk fest where you go around for 45 minutes and nothing gets resolved? So we're back to old problems about deliberation and decision-making in bureaucratic systems. And I'm not sure the technology entirely helps. It brings more people into the conversation. It makes geography less important, but does it make the processes more deliberative and more decisive? Quick notes on Canada, just for those that are watching, and happy to take any more questions. My usual caution on Canada is it is a big federation, and almost anything of any importance in Canada involves alignment of multiple jurisdictions, federal, provincial, and local. I kind of think of our peer group not as the Nordics and Singapore and Estonia, but Germany and Australia, and even to some extent the United States. And the alignment of jurisdictions, it allows for innovation. Things can be tried out at one level of government and then replicated and spread elsewhere. But it also can be really, really challenging to get alignment as well. So I think, as I said, what you're going to pick up is a long cycle of growth in the public sector ending. And also a bit of a mood change. It's very difficult for me to judge, but I think it's quite palpable in Canada that, and this has to influence the way public servants living in communities see the world. That sort of, banging pots and congratulating frontline workers, enthusiasm of 2020 and 21 has given away to a certain snarkiness and negativity, social media, snark and feedback on the public sector. The strike didn't help, which affects how people living in communities see themselves and the work they do. There's a political phenomenon where we have an aging government at the 8-year mark. It's showing some signs of fatigue and burnout, and I think that's different than the startup period of a government. It's difficult to figure out why the Canadian data was a bit of an outlier. I think there may be some made in Canada circumstances. The value of the report, just to go back to where I started, is now I can go to the Public Service Employment Survey, which is a very deep and rich annual set of data for the Canadian public service, and start doing crosstabs and looking for explanatory variables and whatnot. But I would end on a sort of a general note that both looking at this data and what I've seen in the Canadian PSES, I'm much more of the half full interpretation of things, that given all of what we know about hierarchical systems and bureaucracy and dispersed decision making and the interaction with democratic politics, I actually find these are pretty good scores, and I'm looking forward to seeing what next year brings.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, I think that's a very good point on which to end. As I said, we've titled the webinar about resilience in the face of permacrisis, and I think that's a very good point to stress again. Thank you all for your kind of opening reflections. I think that's fascinating and really helps put the data in a bit of a wider context as well. And thank you to everybody who has submitted some questions. We will got a little bit of time now to answer some of them. Thanks to Mark Matuluth, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, for a lot of your questions. We probably won't get to them all, Mark, but just to let you know that I have read them. I will start with one that I'll put to Greta in the first instance from Mark, and perhaps broaden out a little bit. Is there an emerging view that the response from large organizations to COVID-19 was more improvisational than intentional? I guess to some extent, and feel free to disagree, Greta, the response had to be improvisational a bit because it was such an unexpected shock. But I guess if you want to answer that, and then perhaps take the point that comes out, that flows from that from me, which is, have the lessons from the pandemic been kind of absorbed in a kind of systemic way into how services are going to be delivered?
Yeah, I think the responses were a bit colored by the pandemic last time, because all the governments, or at least very many governments, had a special governance, and things could happen really fast. And looking back in the government where I live in Norway, maybe some things happen too fast as well. And there are some lessons learned in Denmark, for example, about that. In Norway, there has been an official report about good and bad things. And one thing I remember very well from this report was actually the lack of documentation around taking decisions. And some very important decisions due to the lockdown was maybe not documented more than on a whiteboard. And then it was taken a picture with a mobile phone. Whereas we have very strict rules for archiving important decisions. In Norway, it's a great deal of transparency. I should be able to track any governmental decision. And it was quite a bit of a shock to read how fast some of these decisions went. But it was like in a war, they had to act fast. So there has been a lot of aftermath in my country, and I know it has been in other Nordic countries too, and it has been actively deployed to improve processes, and I think we will do that for a long time going forward.
And Alexander, I'll come to you. I mean, just on Greta's point there, we had the same in the UK of photographs of whiteboards being shared as kind of the evidence of a former advisor to the UK Prime Minister called Dominic Cummings was using his photographs of whiteboards to show how decision making was being done in 10 Downing Street. I mean, to broaden out the question a little bit, kind of, Alexander, how do you think public services have stood up to the crisis? And if we can do the counterfactual, and perhaps we can't, kind of how is it matched to what you would have expected? Because I imagine there was a lot of kind of, we talk about contingency planning. How do you think the contingency planning has stood up to the contingency when it happened?
Thanks, Richard. Well, look, you know, I will probably offer limited views, as it were, on operations in 10 Downing Street, because I think, you know, we've still got a public inquiry going on here, for example, on the response to COVID. But what I would comment, perhaps drawing out a bit more, is just reflecting on the difference between the 1980s and the experience of the last couple of years. During the tail end of the Cold War, we had a lot more resilience capability in the UK, as was true in many countries. The combination of civil defence planning, of supply chains that were not, not quite so just in time as they became with globalization, and crises that didn't hit with the speed and scale that COVID did. And let's face it, we probably haven't had a crisis of that speed and scale for a very long time indeed. So, my sense is probably a mixed bag. Some areas where government did well, some areas where government was found wanting. I think a much more interesting question is what do we learn from all of this? So as there is this cycle and sequence of a public inquiry, of a range of external reviews, the internal lessons learned exercises, how much can we actually make sure that some of these filter back into the capabilities of government as well as the planning of government for the longer term? And that, I think, is something that most governments, democratic or authoritarian, are quite poor at. So the thing that would really interest me is as we emerge out, as we learn the lessons, how much can we integrate those into public sector capabilities, planning and delivery in the future?
And Michael, do you have any thoughts on kind of your reflections on how well everything's been stood up? You kind of touched on that at the end of your answer, but if you want to expand on it at all. Sorry, you're on mute, Michael, as was I for a second. Classic
pandemic. I mean, change is subject to all sorts of obstacles. They're well known to everybody on this call. Inertia, incrementalism, risk tolerances, and so on. But one of them is resistance. Change always runs into resistance. Somebody benefits from the status quo or is reluctant to let go of it. And I think what's striking about the 2-3 pandemic years is there was a certain force measure which rolled over resistance. University administrations were able to bring in online instruction and evaluation. over the dead bodies of professors and deans. Hospitals were able to make changes, over the resistance of the doctors and the physicians. This is the way I run my practice. The court system, judges had to let go of, this is my courtroom and this is how I run it, and so on. So I think actually in the extended public sector, what happened in courts, policing, universities and colleges, even primary school instruction, doctors, physician visits, as Greta mentioned, is really impressive. And I think that may have just been the ability to sweep away some of the resistance for a while. It will be interesting to see if those forces do snap back and then become, the usual impediments, in the next 4 or 5 years.
Yes, indeed. And as you say, one of the great things about the survey is that we hopefully get that kind of time series data. Just a couple of points I want to touch on as someone kind of involved in the report itself, from a couple of the questions. From Matt Smith, have you seen any statistically significant change since the start of the Ukraine war and increasing tension between China and Western countries? The changes we saw that I set out in the presentation were kind of year-on-year changes. That's the level of granularity that we can go to. I mean, we surmise, as I did in my presentation, that that the kind of the era of permacrisis that everyone's calling it, I think we might have to come up with a better phrase, is kind of contributing to that, and both of those factors that you mentioned in your question add to that kind of atmosphere. So that the kind of greater uncertainty is having an impact. Neil Smits asks, looking at the data for the Netherlands, would there be an explanation or deliberation on the scoring of highest in the disagree section? I'd have to go back and look into that, Niels. I would love, one of the great joys of doing this survey is the number of story ideas for me as a journalist that flow from it. I would love to speak to someone in the Netherlands about why that might be, and kind of how their government is standing up to these pressures. Yeah, I am. Please do get in touch with me if you have any thoughts yourself on why that might be. I don't know if Greta has any thoughts on the Netherlands from her perspective. Fair enough. We've got a question from Gillian Curtin that I'll put to the panel. She says, I am seeing a significant increase in talented people leaving the public service and moving into the private sector. These people are middle management to middle executive level, many of whom expected to spend their entire career in government. Is it normal for top talent to leave mid-career, or does this signal a bigger problem? Put that to you, Michael, in the first instance, to see whether you think there's any kind of change in trend in terms of people leaving government. I know it's something that the UK government has certainly always encouraged, to try and get people more permeability between public and private sectors at different stages in careers. And I'll ask Alexander for his reflections in a second, but is it something that's coming up more, do you think, Michael?
I think it's certainly a concern, but again, if you zoom back, we're in at least in Canada, an incredibly tight and competitive labor market, right across all kinds of skill sets and disciplines. And so chances of getting an attractive offer to do something else are much, much greater. The compensation gap is always there. You can make more money as an IT manager in the private sector. That wasn't the case when tech was crashing and people were leaving the big tech firms and coming into government for safety and security. So it's a little difficult to know whether this is cyclical or long-term. I'm an advocate of having a more porous and open movement between private, not-for-profit, and government. We don't do enough of it. We should be doing more of the professional exchange programs. We don't have to do everything with permanent, long-term tenured public servants. People coming in and out and adding their expertise and energy around specific issues would be a good thing. And I think more people in the private sector experiencing what it's like to work in the public sector would be healthy as well. So I'd actually like to see more back and forth. If the numbers suggest a net drain from the public sector, then you have to be concerned. But as always, what are you going to do about it? Are you prepared to pay people more? Are you prepared to be more proactive in recruitment and so on? You always have to go to what is the solution?
Alexander, do you have any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Richard, and Gillian. It's a great question. I think what we have seen, at least in the data that's been made publicly available so far, is a slight bump, a slight increase in attrition rates over the past year. I think what's difficult to do, and we'll need multi-year data to look at that, how much of that was sort of frozen attrition that was held over from the core period of COVID. So are we basically seeing sort of delayed data that then accentuates?
Yeah.
How much is it the result of a cost of living crisis and some of those accentuated pressures? In fact, probably most keenly felt for the lowest paid public workers, rather than necessarily for those at middle or middle to senior ranks. Full disclosure, I think it's kind of desirable to have a bit more porosity and a bit more flow without politicization. But attrition rates generally for the public sector run too low rather than too high. I think a really interesting question is one about data analytics, which is how much do public sector organizations, do ministries, do regulators, do arm's length bodies have enough information about business critical talent in their organizations at mid and senior level, and have a really granular picture of attrition risk, because that's, I think, where organizations start to fall down. It's as you lose not necessarily the quantity of people at mid-level, but the critical assets you need for your organization going forward.
Thank you, Greta. Do you have any thoughts from a Norwegian perspective?
I've seen statistics for among health professionals in Norway, and especially among nurses post-COVID, and this statistics also show some leaving reasons, which is over a workload and something about the payment gaps as well. So, but overall, attrition has been very high, both in public and private sectors across the Nordic countries right after Corona. So I think there is some natural explanation as well.
And I'll put this question to you as well, Greta, in the first instance as well. It's from Melanie Robert, who says there's a lot less time for beautifully crafted policy and a lot more need. So it's a key point, the need to understand user needs and technology, to manage stakeholders and have the street savvy to implement changes, work collaboratively, and just to plain operationalize. This is often seen as plumbing in government, and they're not the skills that have got public servants promoted in the past. Could it be that we require a new breed of public service managers and leaders, and that it is hard to find them or grow them? I mean, I think that's a really interesting perspective on the kind of leadership we need to get the kind of changes that will help make for more responsive governments. Do you think these are kind of different skills that leaders need to learn, and how can we help them learn them?
Yeah, I saw that question. It's really interesting. I do a lot of work with integrating healthcare between local governments and specialized healthcare. And traditionally, the healthcare system has promoted people that are the best doctors and the best nurses in medicine and clinical routines. And that is important, but it's as well extremely important to be able to be a transformative leader, to change culture, behaviors, to be a collaborative leader, to be able to work with stakeholders across entire, because you're working with a system change, not only in your department in the organization. For example, if you're rolling out citizen services, it's not only affecting you and your department or your part of the hospital, it's affecting a range of stakeholders. And I think this is a very valid point for the new era of civil servants. We still need those people who are very, very deep skilled and have expertise in special fields, but I think we need more change makers in public services. You can't only rely on external consultants to do this work. You have to take ownership and be able to drive the big transformations.
And Alexander, if I can come to you on that point, and then to Michael. I mean, from my perspective, it wouldn't be that those skills about kind of managing stakeholders, having the street savvy to implement changes are ones that wouldn't have got public servants promoted in the past, although perhaps you'll disagree on that, but more that they're just really difficult to get and to keep in the public service, and that's the reason that they're lacking, perhaps.
Look, I very much agree that I think we need to upgrade, if you like, the skills mix for public servants. But I think some of what's described here in Melanie's question are classic public service skills. I don't think they're necessarily novel. The change making and leadership part is not novel, but it's underrepresented, I would argue, in government. And for me, by the way, former colleagues in Whitehall in the UK system don't like me when I say this, but I will say it. I think it reflects the challenge that we have an East Wing, West Wing split in government. But people who like to do policy and strategy, they're the West Wingers, buzzing around ministers and the centre of government and doing exciting things and being on the news agenda. An awful lot of the government is done by the East Wing. It's a bit that gets stuff done. And it picks up on Michael's point earlier about citizen-facing services. I think part of the real challenge of 21st century governance is how do we better connect the plumbing between the West Wing and the East Wing. It's not asking East Wingers to become West Wingers or vice versa, but we do need people who can integrate. And that actually, I would argue, is another argument for porosity. Because if you have people stepping out, having some experience in consulting or in local government or in the health service, and then stepping back in, they bring with them different perspectives, different skills, different organizational intelligence of how cultures work and don't work. But I would say that, wouldn't I, Gov? I've stepped out 4 times now. I always come back for the glamour and the money, or so I tell myself.
I'm sure that's true. Michael, what do you tell your students in terms of what skills they need to prioritise to help them get on in a career in the public service?
I like the metaphor. I mean, so much of the public sector is operations services, transactions, internal services. There's a kind of a tendency to talk about the policy community and the policy process. Not that that isn't important, but I'd actually like to see more attention paid to slogging through the operational parts of government, who don't always get the kind of attention in resources or priority that they should. The skill set issue, I mean, I'll just throw in another point, and I've written pieces and spoken at parliamentary committees about this. Part of it will take care of itself. With an 8% churn, we will bring in new people with new skills and mindsets and turn over half the management community in 5 years. But there's a stock and flow issue here, and I've called for a doubling of investment in training and leadership development. If you're worried about excessive dependency on management consultants, then you have to make an offsetting investment in leadership development within the public sector. And we just, in Canada, I can only speak for, we don't do nearly enough. And if the governing and delivering in the 2020s and 2030s is going to have this kind of pace and short cycle time and attention deficit disorder, we have to really double or redouble our effort on learning, training, and leadership development.
And just one final question. We're coming very quickly to the end of our webinar today. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks to all our panel for joining. Just one final question I want to touch on the kind of digital side. The report kind of found that, or the survey found kind of less confidence in the use of how digital is being embedded in public services, but it also found that the pandemic had made a difference there, that people thought that technology was kind of one of the things that had been bolstered in terms of the pandemic response and how governments use it. I mean, there's a little bit of a distinction there. I just think it's very interesting that digital transformation seems to be one of those things that perhaps is always on the horizon and never quite, perhaps for a rank and file civil servant, never kind of comes to their desk, does it? And I wanted to get Greta's thoughts on kind of how how far on is digital transformation in the organisations you work on? The examples on the slides were very good ones that you shared, but would that be the case across all of the kind of government organisations in Norway, that they're that up to speed with digital?
I think you would experience that Norway is quite far compared to many other countries in the Western world. How come? I think we have a penetration of use of broadband and smartphone that is really in top in European countries. And I think our geography also have forced us to use digital solutions in all aspects. We were very early adopters of internet banking. So when they still used checks in the US, we had internet banking many years ago. I never used anything else. So we have both private sector and public sector has been digital for quite a long time. So we are not putting kind of electricity on paper anymore. It's more like the second, third round of digitization we are having, where we are really starting utilizing the data and making proactive citizen services. So perhaps you don't need to, we have a kindergarten space for everyone that needs it in Norway. So you perhaps don't need to apply for it. You get offered kindergarten if you move to a new town. And you get offered a school for your children if you are moving into a city. And the doctor can see when he should approach you, because there are some data that is not good for you. So I think not all departments not all sectors in the public sector are as good. I think the justice sector in Norway is now jumping into a big digital transformation. They're a little bit behind the health sector and central government. But I'd say that we are fairly digital, but we still have a lot to do. And we also have this literacy problem. Of course, there are elderly people and others that are not having the bank ID, and that creates problems because you can't do anything without using your national ID. And that has created some problems in the health system as well. But I think most have taken the approach that if we can serve 70–80% digital, we have enough resources to serve the latter 20% with physical traditional services.
Thanks very much. And Alexander, you held up your phone earlier to indicate the point that services on your phone kind of outstrip a lot of government ones. What should we be, if we kind of think about rerunning this survey next year, or kind of looking in the medium term, should we be thinking about a world where government services match the private sector services, or is that kind of unobtainable? And if that is unobtainable, what are the consequences for that for governments and what their citizens think?
So thanks, Richard. I mean, look, I will never be able to match some of the investment that's made, and that's okay. So I want to channel my public sector optimist here, because I think there is something here to celebrate. And three things I'd celebrate. One is the sense that actually government can be at its best a really effective fast follower. So it can take adaptation and adoption from elsewhere and bring it into the public sector and make it work. The second thing I point to is I do think there are successful examples of digital services being offered by a range of governments around the world, both in terms of G2G, so internal government to government services, and in terms of G2C, in this case, government to citizen services. And a bit more of what we need to do in the education agenda that Michael mentioned, which I think is so important. I would say that as a professor at LSE, but is we need to be kind of growing our case deck of successful case studies and how they worked and why they worked and what could be replicable, what could be learnable elsewhere. But the third thing is just recognizing, I think, that there's really strong appetite from public servants themselves to find new ways to use technology to engage technology in what they do, either on the policy or the operational front. So how do we unleash some of that innovation within government? And to that end, I would just say that there is, I think, I'm certainly representative of a dying generation. What do I mean by that? I'm 49 years old. I was the last generation of people who transited from an analog to a digital world. And almost all public servants now are people who have been operating in a digital world by default. So how do we kind of engage that, make use of that, and accelerate that in government, recognizing we will never have as much money as we might want?
And Michael, do you want to make any closing remarks, either optimistic or otherwise?
Well, I think being much, much older than Alexander actually makes me more optimistic, because you can see, looking back, waves of innovation, the first generation internet, the, second generation internet, the arrival of smartphones and apps, and you can see the progress and the rising expectations that come with it. What you can do now in transactional services was impossible to contemplate 10 years ago. But I would close on perhaps the theme, looking forward, is where the public sector interacts with, democratic politics and supporting a democracy. I don't really want to trust my future to Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or to the autocrats. I think supporting democratic government and democratic society is really a key part of working in the public sector in the 2020s. The standards on cybersecurity, on privacy, on racial and gender bias, on equity and inclusion are very different than those on the tech platforms. And I think rightly so. They make life more complicated. You have to provide services in 2 official languages at a minimum. You have to, formats that are available for persons with all kinds of disabilities, and I could go on and on. And governments cannot leave people out and choose their customers the way that a private sector firm can. So, the analogy is only stretched so far. The important thing about the public sector is public interest and the stewardship and trusteeship that goes with that.
Great, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you everybody for joining this webinar. Today I'm going to have to bring the session to a close here, but thank you, as I say, to all of our panel for joining us, and thank you to everyone who has been watching along, and many thanks to our knowledge partner, PA Consulting, for supporting the Responsive Government Survey throughout and this webinar too. You will be receiving a recording of this session when it is available in the next few days, and also a report on the session in the next few weeks. Before that though, there should be a survey in your inbox very shortly to get your thoughts on today's session. It would really help me and the team here at Global Government Forum if you could complete that to help us make sure we're providing the best possible content for everyone. And any ideas on future topics you would like us to cover in webinars would be welcome too. We run a range of webinars here at GGF, and one upcoming one that might be of interest is Diverse and Thrive, how building more inclusive and diverse organisations can improve delivery. That's on the 16th of May. I did see a question related to diversity that we didn't get to, so please do come along to that and ask your question to that panel. That'll be a great discussion as well. So thanks again to everybody for joining us today, and we hope to see you at another one of our webinars soon. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye.